It's an exciting time for device-based therapies for hypertension, and particularly as we recognize today is World Hypertension Day too. And specifically, we recognize that hypertension is the leading cause of death and disability worldwide. And moreover, more than half of individuals with hypertension do not meet societal or guideline recommended treatment goals. So it has a large public health impact. And renal denervation therapy has traveled a very storied path over the past 10, 15 years now, specifically with initial unbridled enthusiasm to disillusionment with the Hypertension 3 study, and then now really revitalized with 5 successive sham-controlled randomized clinical trials with 2 different treatment methods showing not only statistically significant, but clinically significant, clinically meaningful improvements in blood pressure. Just as a background, the SPYRAL HTN-ON MED study was a trial randomizing patients to either renal denervation versus sham-controlled in a blinded fashion, in an assessor blinded fashion. It was performed at international sites, and we've recently presented and published in the journal Lancet the 3-year outcomes of that trial, showing sustained, if not even greater, reductions in blood pressure in the renal denervation group over longer term follow-up. That analysis was based principally on single time point measurements, 1-year blood pressure in the office setting, 3-year blood pressure in the office setting, but it didn't more comprehensively evaluate the hypertensive burden of individual patients. And to that end, we performed an extended analysis looking at time in target range or time in therapeutic range, where for a given blood pressure threshold, we look at the time spent by these individual patients at or below that pre-specified blood pressure level. So specifically, for instance, for a blood pressure of less than 140 systolic in the office setting, but also 140 systolic in the ambulatory 24-hour blood pressure assessment, we show consistently that renal denervation therapy is associated with a significant improvement in time spent in the targeted range compared to the sham control group. And those findings were observed across different measures, systolic office blood pressure versus systolic 24-hour blood pressure. They were observed across different blood pressure thresholds, 130 or 140 millimeters mercury. And they were also observed in the context of similar medication burden between the 2 groups, and if but anything, a higher medication burden in the sham control group, which would bias against the renal denervation group. But we saw continued benefit with renal denervation. Time in target range is becoming increasingly established as a validated measure of control of chronic disease state conditions. For quite some time, for instance, in diabetes, time in target range has gained attention, and more recently it has in the field of hypertension too. Time in target range as an individual measure is independently predictive of major cardiovascular events, and it's independently predictive of other measures like mean systolic blood pressure or blood pressure variability. It's time that we started to focus more on examining blood pressure or considering blood pressure for individual patients is in the context of their hypertension burden. That is not simply a blood pressure measurement at one clinic visit versus another, but thinking about the totality of the time that they're spending with severe hypertension that may be unrecognized or alternatively within a targeted range. And specifically, the Global Simplicity Registry data presented also at this meeting showed that for the first time with a device therapy like renal denervation, that the greater time spent in target range after renal denervation is associated with a meaningful reduction in major adverse events that include mortality, that include stroke, and include myocardial infarction. We're not quite at the point where renal denervation therapy is available commercially, but we're nearing and hopeful to be nearing that point through the completion of ongoing clinical trials. And then we start to think about, as has already been proposed by societal documents in both Europe and the United States, about patient indications and who might be the ideal patient population. And rather than focus specifically on blood pressure numbers of 140 or 150 systolic or 90 diastolic, put simply, I think we are considering this for individuals with uncontrolled hypertension despite guideline recommended therapies, including drug therapies and or lifestyle interventions. We're ruling out secondary causes of hypertension, and importantly, we'd like to confirm severe hypertension by more than just a measure in the office setting alone, whether it's an ambulatory assessment or home blood pressure monitoring. ideally having endorsement from more than one provider, skilled or with experience in the field of hypertension, and very, very importantly, with patient in a shared decision-making process, that is incorporating patient preference rather into the process as well.